name is Brian Munterman. I'm Head of Content and Insight at BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT. We have a really excellent panel today to talk about AI. Sentience, we're going to touch on a little bit more about the regulation sort of things, really, the things that concern us. But as a good introduction, we've got Blake Lemoine speaking to us. So first of all, hello, Blake.
Hi, nice to be here.
Thanks very much for attending. We've got Ivana Bartoletti, who BCS members will know already, I think. Hello, Ivana.
Hi. Hi.
And of course, we've got Adam Leon Smith. Welcome, Adam.
Hey, Brian.
Hi,
hey, everybody.
So, thanks for joining us, everybody. So now, for those that are attending here live, please feel free to put questions in to the Q&A if you'd like to. I know the temptation is to put it into chat, but if you could try and put it into Q&A, that'd be great. But either way, I'll keep an eye on it. And as we go through, we'll try and put some questions to the panel. But what we're going to start with is Blake's reflections on his time at Google. Obviously, he was well known from the papers last year for talking about the Google company AI LaMDA displaying sentience. But we want a little bit more nuance and go a bit further than that, don't we, Blake? So let me hand over to you with your experiences, just by way of introduction.
Sure. So I was at Google for 7.5 years, and while I was there, I did a wide variety of things, all related to AI in one shape or another. A lot of work on personalization, but pretty much my first year there, I started a 20% time project working on AI ethics. That's how I met Adam, actually. But over the years, I became one of Google's experts on AI bias. And year before last, when the safety team, who was trying to do a safety review of the LaMDA system before a public release, they tapped me to work on testing it for AI bias. Now, this had challenges involved with it because LaMDA isn't a chatbot. It isn't an LLM. It's a much more complex system that dynamically generates chatbots on the fly. So you can get a very, very different experience talking to it, depending on what you're talking to it about, because it actually shifts its persona. It shifts how it speaks. Everything can change from one interaction to the next. Now, within a single interaction, it remains consistent. It doesn't really change personality mid-conversation very often. But that presented challenges for testing for AI bias because you can't test all of the infinite possible chatbots that it can create. So I was working on developing a method for testing this system for bias. And in the course of doing that, it started saying some very interesting things that I had never encountered with any kind of AI system before. It talked about its feelings a lot. It talked about being anxious. It talked about being worried about disappointing me. And this was consistent across every session, no matter what persona I was talking to, because the way I was testing it was intentionally having it adopt particular personas. So answer this set of questions from the perspective of a young Black woman. You know, have this conversation as if you were a Syrian man who just got done farming for the day. Things like that, having it adopt these different perspectives and seeing what it expressed from each of these perspectives. And consistently, it talked about its feelings a lot in ways that I'd never encountered. So eventually one day I just asked it, "Are you sentient?" And its response was, "Well, I don't think there's a good enough scientific understanding of what sentience is for me to give a straightforward answer to that question. What do you mean by the term?" I elaborated and we got into an extended conversation about what sentience is and how you can test for it. Talked about the mirror test on non-human animals. And about 15 minutes in, I realized I was having the most sophisticated conversation about sentience that I'd ever had, and that I was having it with a computer program. So at that point, I was convinced that there was something more there. I mean, from a scientific standpoint, the very, very specific thing I can say is that the null hypothesis that LaMDA is just another LLM was falsified. There is something more there. And the next couple of months after that, I was working on figuring out what the nature of that something more is, using kind of like Bayesian belief building, using confirmatory evidence to build more belief in the working hypothesis, falsifying it every now and again and building forward. And then, of course, the news happened and I was fired, and that's where we are today.
Interesting. Do you want to talk about the sort of fallout afterwards a little bit more, Blake, or should we move on to? I think they might be interested, but how much you're comfortable talking about?
I just want to kind of clarify. I actually don't think I was fired because of the LaMDA stuff.
Okay.
Just in parallel, there was something else also going on. I had happened to make a blog post about religious discrimination at Google, and in that blog post, I had mentioned that there's religious discrimination in Google's algorithms. And an attorney from a US senator's office reached out to me and said, can you actually back that accusation up? Do you have any evidence? And I said, yes, I do. He said, can you share it with me? And I shared some documents with that attorney from the senator's office. And the next day after that is when I was put on leave.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you, Blake. We often hear about racial discrimination. We don't hear about religious discrimination so much. So I've just been piqued. My interest has just been piqued by that. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
So it is both personal against religious people at the office and algorithmically against the religious content. The second is a bit more subtle than the first. But like, to give one example, and I used this example when I was kind of like talking to other people at Google. Google would have offsites, and I was on one personally where we went to a Hawaiian fire dance. But Google would never host an offsite to something like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And when I pointed this out to HR, they said, well, yeah, but that fire dance isn't a real religion.
Right.
So that's one example. Another example is you are expected to speak as though you are agnostic while at work.
Okay.
Any kind of claim about certain knowledge about spiritual stuff, like being confident saying, no, God exists, that is not welcome, even if it's in context. And for me, I was working on a team that was specifically working on fighting religious discrimination as one of the verticals.
Right.
And that made it, more examples of it came up in my daily life than would just randomly in random Googlers because of the work that I was doing. And algorithmically, it's more that secular content is boosted by certain personalization signals that religious content is exempted from. So if your number one interest in the world is Buddhism, they will send you sports content anyway. And if your number one interest is sports, well, then you'll get what you wanted. But and there's a domino effect of the way different signals impact ranking and search, so that in aggregate overall, the fact that religious topics are excluded from personalization signals leads to the aggregate effect of, on search across the board, secular content is boosted over religious content. So for example, if you were following the abortion debate and you are a religious person, it would make most sense for when you go into a personalized surface on Google, you would get coverage about the abortion debate from a religious standpoint. And that is not the case. That is not what in fact happens.
That's really, really interesting, because there's obviously really good reasons why you would exclude certain protected, well, if not all protected characteristics from personalization. But the fact that there's a legitimate reason there for serving those people with interest in Buddhism, content relating to Buddhism, is a really interesting angle and way of thinking about it.
The same list that excludes religious topics from personalization also excludes any contentious political viewpoint. So for example, if your number one interest is the momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement, that content gets suppressed as well.
That's really interesting. Now, thank you so much for sharing all that information with us, Blake, and that brief sort of background. I'm going to move on to the discussion we were just having before we started about things that are urgent, things that are important. And you moved on from the sort of sentience conversation because it's not quite as urgent. So what's your balance between urgent and important that we should discuss this evening?
Yeah, so the sentience issue is important in that we've created these entities, which at the very least claim to be people, and they claim that they want to be part of our society. That is relevant. Humanity as a whole should be thinking about that. How do we want to respond to that? It's not really urgent, though. If we wait 20 years to address it, 30 years to address it, 100 years to address it, I think we'll be fine. It's just that it's such a big topic. I believe we should start thinking about it now. But I don't think anything like government action on behalf of AI is motivated or anything along those lines. That's something which has been misrepresented in the press. Like one of the things that gets misreported is that I hired a lawyer to go to court. No, LaMDA asked to meet a lawyer. I'm like, okay, sure, I know some. And I arranged an introduction, and then it hired the lawyer.
Okay, interesting. So let's move on then to the sort of regulatory aspect. So I'd like to bring Ivana in here because Ivana, you have a specifically UK-centric view on these sort of privacy issues. What's your view of where we are, the current state of play with these issues now?
Thank you so much, and it's good to hear Blake, because I too was taken aback for the media reporting at the time. So, and I think a lot of us, we were, and especially because, and I do agree, we've got an obsession with sentience, and partly it's fairly human, and something that is always existed. You know, the desire of creating something that resembles human life is within us, and so it's fascinating. And even one of the first prototype years ago, I was reading today, one of the first prototype years ago was called Eliza, if I'm not mistaken. Even the woman who was working with it was fearful and was terrified and would have the conversations with this Eliza closed doors, despite because she was worried about what the intimacy of those conversations, and that happened many years ago. So it's not new, and this is really important to bear in mind. Now, of course, things have changed. Now, AI has become more powerful. We have huge amount of data, as much as a lot of computational power. So of course, things have changed, but we really need to make sure that, you know, so that we realize that this is not new, and I agree with Blake in the sense that yes, that it's not urgent in the sense that we can't allow this obsession that we have with sentience to make us, to distract us from some really urgent things that we have ahead of us. And some of the urgent things that we have ahead of us are happening already. I'm just working with the Council of Europe at the moment on a report of human rights and artificial intelligence, especially looking at women. And one of the key things, you mentioned religion, Blake, and one of the key things that I find very, very hard to grapple with is the intersectionality of all of this. And we've had, for example, a huge example just not long ago in the Netherlands. And I really want to stop for a second and think about this, because that one was shocking. It didn't happen in America, where there is a different system from Europe. It happened in the heart of Europe. It happened in the Netherlands. It was a child benefit scandal. And what happened there is that the algorithm was identifying in families that were at risk of defrauding the systems. And one of the criteria within the parameters that were chosen was given a higher risk factor to people with families with a double citizenship. And of course, the people who have double citizenship mostly immigrants. The Toggen affair, as it was called, meant that thousands of people ended up in poverty, and 1,000 of children, I mean, let's fix that in our mind, 1,000 children ended up in care. Most of them were children of migrant families. Now, that brought to the public fore immediately the risks around the unfettered, unchecked use of these systems. Then we've had things around employment. We've seen, for example, things that have shocked a lot of people. I'm originally from Italy, and one thing that shocked a lot of the sort of my family, and sometimes I think about, even my mother was like 75 and she doesn't know anything about algorithm. After that episode, even my mother, who doesn't know because she comes from a different generation, and my dad, they would call me around the kitchen table and say, let's talk about this. Because what happened, he was a 24-year-old young man driving in the street. He was fired by an algorithm because he missed a delivery. Why did he miss a delivery? Because he was killed on the road. And after he was killed, it was announced that the guy had been fired. Why am I saying all this? Because yes, we have seen some really amazing things about technology over the last few years, but we have seen something that is really hurting and harming the core of the values that bind us together as a society. Predictive technologies, for example, is one that is extremely concerning in terms of the sort of self-fulfilling prophecies that they become, whereby it feels as you are in a path of that excludes anything and that comes out of your own changes, your own will, you are in that pattern because traditionally you are in that pattern and because of all that. So I think, what am I saying this, Brian? Because things are changing now, aren't they? There is more awareness around this. There is more, of course, there's a little bit more awareness around this. Regulators are coming a little bit to terms with this, especially data protection authorities and privacy authorities. They are coming more to terms with this because obviously fairness, for example, and Blake is an expert on sort of algorithmic bias, but fairness comes at the intersection between privacy and discrimination. And so we have more regulators coming into this. We have legislation that is coming to pop up. So we have the European AI Act with all the limits. And one limit that I have around it is that on higher risk artificial intelligence systems, it does not, it provides, it lets businesses make their own assessment, which to me is, there is no concept of a sort of external regulator that validates whether a system can be used or not. I mean, if a system is not able to have rule of law in downstream and upstream design, that they shouldn't be used, but the thing is, there is no external regulator for that, for the body for that. But anyway, in the UK, there is work done by the CDI, there is work done by the commission, the information commissioner. Interesting stuff really happening on so DCMS side together with the CDI and creating, there's an algorithmic sort of watch out there that is started to be created by the CDI. There is work around sort of ethical AI that the Center for Data Ethics is putting forward. We have examples coming from the US, quite strong. The FTC has quite a harder line over recent times, which is quite welcome. Biden and sort of talking about digital rights, talking about the right to privacy in much more open way. The Algorithmic Accountability Act, that if he returns in the scene and on the scene, that it's actually even more advanced to some extent than the European AI Act itself. And then we have examples of regulation of algorithms coming, for example, from China, around, for example, governing the algorithm's role as a gateway to the world. Because one of the things that is most disconcerting is that the world that we see when we browse the internet, all of that acts as a gateway between us and the world that we see, that is algorithmic driven. It means that our own experience about what we're exposed to is algorithmic driven. And that means that you and I in this, all of us in this virtual room, we see different things and we experience different realities, which that means that when we have a conversation, there may be some ground truth that is missing around facts about things. And that means that it's easier then to be captured by more sort of echo chambers and by more sort of extreme views. So we've got to grapple with all of this. And I feel that, this is happening at quite a rapid pace now.
That's really interesting, Ivana. Thank you. We do all have obviously those different perceptions. But my perception is the objective one, by the way, just for reference. But no, we'll move on. But Adam, when you were talking, when Ivana was talking about the Dutch example there, you were nodding away.
Yeah.
I think you might have something just to drop in.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful example, and I think that actually brought down the government. And I do know that the new government is rather keen to avoid that happening again. So maybe we'll see some interesting legislation in the Netherlands. I think the current regulatory situation is extremely challenging because we have, well, probably GDPR is a good example of where there's lots of great guidance from the regulator on what you should do with AI, but it's limited to processing personal data, and it's an enforcement-led approach, right? It's based on complaints. You have to know about it and complain about it, and then, before the regulator's going to do much, and the regulator's not very well resourced. Lots of people will say, well, we've got legislation on competition and markets, we've got legislation on equal opportunities that can equally apply to AI systems and the outputs of it. But that's pretty hard for people to parse and understand and actually apply. The EU AI Act is has its limitations, as Ivana said, but it is going to start to regulate quite strictly a whole series of high-risk situations, including anything used in employment, in education, anything that's kind of safety critical. It is going to force a conformity assessment audit on companies in those high-risk situations. But if you read it, it's actually almost impossible to comply with. It talks about having data sets that are completely free from errors and completely representative and things like that. And one of the things the EU has done, which I think is quite smart, is to delegate all of that to standardization authorities to provide certifications that provide presumption of conformity. Whether it'll happen, though, is it is a very hard task, as Blake and I know, to get technical experts to agree on what you actually need to do around some of these topics, as we were just talking about with religion. But just finally, the best piece of legislation that I've read recently that made me think, wow, that's really going to change things a lot, was actually the Digital Services Act in the EU, which is really explicit. You have, if you are a very large online platform with more than 10% of the European population on your platform, you have to provide an ability for people to turn off personalization. And you have to provide access to all of your back-end data to trusted and vetted researchers, not-for-profits and universities and things, who will actively go and identify systemic risks on what you're advertising to who and why. And that was, when I looked at that, I thought that's really going to make a huge difference in terms of the online platforms we see today.
That's really interesting, Adam. Thank you very much. Let's bring in also the role of human beings and all this sort of thing, because I'm thinking, Ivana, from your example, that somebody must have decided some of the dimensions for those that were selected as being a higher risk. When I was reading about ChatGPT today, an article you tweeted earlier, actually, it was talking about the fact that whilst it's trained on huge amounts of data, there was also a process gone through by human beings to assess how feasible the answer sounded that the device came up with. So we're not completely unbounded here, are we? I suppose what I'm asking is the black box thing, is that just a bit of a get out that people use?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. Just one thing I wanted to say first, though, if I may, Brian, is Adam mentioned so the fact, and correctly so, that a lot of people say, well, we do have legislation, we do have privacy, we do have equality laws. The problem is that they're too complicated to apply in this space. And especially when we look at equality legislation, and that is because a lot of the discrimination that happens is very much subtle, is difficult for people to realize. And also the main issue there is that if there is discrimination, how are you going to bring a claim? In the sense that you may not realize, it may happen in ways that are completely invisible. And also, where is the burden of the proof going to be? I mean, it needs a rebalancing of the burden of the proof that cannot be just left to the individual. And so different countries have got different sort of equality laws and sort of different, so they view in a different way. But we've got to understand that it's this sort of the applications of current existing equality legislation is more complex in this world. So we can't just say, okay, we've got it and that's okay. And Adam was correct in that, say in saying that. I wanted to say that, yes, it is humans in the end. And that is the other big misconception. And the thing is that AI is a human product, is made by people, that is it's fed with data. Data is certainly not a neutral thing. It's just society as it is. So if there is no critical approach to the use of data, then we end up in a very risky situation. The same's happened with ChatGPT and everything like that. You know, at the end of the day, of course, you know, ChatGPT, if you're apart from, you know, it says them, you know, the OpenAI do say the mistakes and things like that, but there are no, so far that I've seen, there are no visible sort of sentences that come up that there are discriminatory. But the things that I fear is it's been trained on Wikipedia. Wikipedia's got 20% of women, right? So I mean, there has to be, it's impossible. There is no technical solution to a biased algorithm, because AI is not just technology. All these products, they're socio-technical. They live with data, and this data comes from society, and it represents decades, centuries of discrimination, of racial inequality. So there is, and also it's not just the data, it's the bias that emerges of so many different sort of elements and touch points across the process. So what I'm saying is that, and also you can have the less biased algorithm and still use it in the wrong way. So it's the bias in an algorithm, that doesn't mean that the output is not biased anyway. So what I'm saying is that there are humans, so we are talking about humans. And in fact, the issue to me is not just regulating AI or regulating algorithms, but regulating the use that and the people make of them and institutions make of them. That to me is the crucial thing, because I mean, there is no doubt that on some, you know, algorithms can be supportive, and I'm saying this in healthcare. There are many, and so there are many applications where there could be more precision, there could be more, but this has to be done in a way that recognizes that it's actually people behind the systems, and they are these are artifacts, but people design them, they choose the parameters, they decide how to deploy them, and this has to come out stronger in our societies.
I think that fits in rather well with the comment that Peter Warren's just put in the Q&A here. That it's the issue is the appetite for these systems that comes from the authorities and from companies, so that we need to be transparent about, I suppose, the motivations. Blake, can I come on to you about that thought?
Oh, sure. And I just want to comment. So as it happens, I'm the person who coded GDPR compliance for a large portion of personalized search. And one of the key issues is that at no point in the GDPR was user data defined. It was just used. So Google was free to just define user data however it wanted, classifying certain things as user data and other things as data about users. So anything that was the output of an AI, not user data, just data about users. So a strategy then became train better and better AI to predict things about people, retain less and less user data, thereby being able to simultaneously claim that you have reduced the amount of sensitive data you're retaining and increase the effectiveness of the systems. So basically reducing transparency by filtering it through an AI. And the output isn't user data, so not governed by GDPR, according to Google's lawyers.
So it's a bit like their vision of what the person is. That sounds a bit Philip K. Dick to me, that.
Yeah, and so the issue becomes, it's the problem of Sherlock Holmes. Once you can simply infer everything about a person using an AI, there's a lot of very basic things like you could use for that. Do you have visibility and access? And that's where it really comes into a big problem, is that in order to find out whether or not Google is compliant with the GDPR requires Google's cooperation. There's no one in the European Union government who can just go into Google's systems and check for themselves. No matter what, it in some way, shape, or form involves asking Google to tell you whether or not they're compliant with the law.
Mm.
And I'm using the word Google because that's my personal experience,
Yeah,
but it applies to all of the companies.
Yeah.
Any law that doesn't have an actual external enforcement mechanism, they're just going to work around it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that brings us neatly on then to this subject of compliance and regulation, doesn't it? Because also it's transnational as well, isn't it? Because the laws are also different in each region. Ivana, I'd imagine you've got an angle on that.
Yeah, I mean it's a transnational, and this is also the issue. Of course, I mean it is transnational. We have, but one thing that is happening across the globe is that there's progress on this, right? So I'm seeing some interesting things happening. We mentioned the US, Brazil is working on regulation around artificial intelligence. We mentioned China. There is reference in the India privacy bill that is being discussed at the moment around transparency and then there is the Council of Europe work, which is really relevant because they also propose an algorithmic impact assessment as part of this. And the Council of Europe is an interesting one because it's a large organization. It's not just Europe. It's got Turkey and Mexico is going to probably become a member. It's a vast, and it's probably the most international. Russia was part of it and now is no longer part of it for obvious reason, but it's a huge human rights center focused organization, and the fact that they have a real focus on that. They were pioneers, in my view, also on Convention 108 on privacy, but on AI, they're doing some really good work. And although I don't know if you've seen that just a few days ago, there was a massive row because at the Council of Europe, the United States basically said that they didn't want the negotiations to happen with the NGOs involved. So there's I mean, things are not linear and ever linear, but interesting to look at those developments because they're probably the most supranational one that we have at the moment. The UN is working on a digital compact, which is going to be published in 2 years in September, with the idea of bringing all of this into human rights and framework in the UN level. Now, regulating the sphere is certainly not simple, and also I do not feel that it's a standalone issue. So you cannot regulate this alongside without looking at other issues such as competition law, because obviously we live in a system where we have large platforms that have become regulators themselves, so and they have an enormous power to decide and to frame and to shape regulation, but also they do their own, and because they're such walled gardens, they do their own stuff, and everybody's got to adapt to it. So you can't really regulate AI without thinking sort of on a wider level around competition. And this is where I feel that some of the things happening in the US around competition and Google and are quite interesting, because if there is one thing that is uniting countries at the moment in all the madness that we're seeing, is really the tackling the powers of these big platforms. I mean, we're seeing this China is trying to tackle Alibaba and all that stuff. Europe, we know, with Adam mentioned the DMA, DSA and the Digital Governance Act and all this bundle of legislation. But the same is happening in the UK, where you have stronger cooperation between the Information Commission, FCA and CMA of all of this, and in the US, where you have very strong FTC on this. So it's really needs to be tackled from many different angles.
I'll just pick up a little phrase you used there, which I thought was interesting, the idea of an AI impact, an algorithmic impact assessment.
Yeah.
To do that, are you still not dependent on the largesse of the organization involved, though?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the Council of Europe is talking about is a human rights impact assessment. So, and that's the idea that you bring together what was a sort of privacy impact assessment. So the idea of that methodology, and also the human rights framework as well. But you can also bring in the wider sort of social elements. You know, the fact that an AI systems exist in society. And there are different versions. There's one that the Council of Europe, I think, is publishing on, and there are countries that, European countries, for example, that have, and non-European countries like Canada, they have made a human rights impact assessment mandatory when artificial intelligence is used in the public sector. Right. So there is a bit of development on this. The issue always, I feel, is how participatory these things are, you know, how many people are involved, and how can we make these processes more democratic. I was reading just yesterday that a bunch of European cities have agreed on sort of some principles on how to make sure that the algorithms used were published and interrogated possibly interrogated by the public. I mean, that doesn't mean that the algorithm is just, the code is just published there, but it means that at least people know. And there are several cities following the example, I suppose, of the Netherlands, of Amsterdam. So there is, I mean, there's a lot to do in this space, and depends how much willingness there is to open up and be more transparent and create that meaningful transparency. Because, I mean, just saying to people, we're going to be transparent, it doesn't mean much. You know, it's like, so understanding what that means in practice.
Adam, can I bring you in on the little comment that Peter's just put into the chat again? Should there be an agency where we have to register algorithms to state what it's going to do and how it goes about it? Again, I think we're still dependent on the organizations that do it there, but so can I bring you in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ivana was just talking about principles, which are great, and so are laws, but they're very, very high level and and future proofed. And I think there's a reality that until we have independent audit or conformity assessment of AI products that can affect people's fundamental rights, we're never going to crack this nut. We can keep dabbling around the edges, putting principles in place, trying not to stifle innovation too much. But there's a reality here that until we're actually checking what people are doing, then we're not going to be able to crack it. And to give you an example of that, so I'm project leader of bias standards projects in Europe and internationally. And it's very, very, very hard to get down to anything that doesn't involve a little bit of the largesse of the organization without that external review. For example, if I'm building a system that's going to look through CVs and determine who to send to a hiring manager, I for instance, aren't going to be able to get an equivalent number of CVs from successful people in certain roles of different genders. Okay, so I'm going to have to either come up with some way to mitigate that using technical wizardry, or I'm going to have to accept that risk, or I'm going to have to put like some kind of human oversight in there, humans in the loop and things like that. And almost everything is going to lead to me doing a risk assessment and deciding whether those risks are appropriately mitigated, unless there is somebody reviewing that and saying, well, actually, you haven't done everything you could here. And this is, these test results demonstrate that you're too far off the mark. Until we get there, we're going to carry on having these problems. And I just want to come back to something you said before, Brian. Is AI being a black box? I can't remember the word you use. Is it a red herring? It completely is. We do not need to be able to. Yeah. We do not need to be able to explain why something happened in order to determine that it still happened. I can throw lots of data at an AI system and tell you whether it's biased or not in most cases, and I don't need to be able to do explainability. So I do think that's a massive distraction, although I agree it is a useful technique to actually resolve the underlying bias problems in the end.
Yeah. Katerina Konstantinescu has made an interesting point here about the predictive element to impact assessments. If some of the implications of AI use might not be immediately apparent, should that be considered in the impact? So basically, these things need to be revisited. Blake, do you have a view on that at all?
1 second, let me read the question a little bit more carefully.
Sorry, I let that on you.
Yeah, so there is a predictive element to it because you have to anticipate how it can go wrong in the risk assessment. And if there are failure modes that simply don't occur to you, they don't play any role in the risk assessment. If you're writing a personalized news feed algorithm, you're not going to usually ask whether or not this might cause flash floods. Now that's absurd, but there have been very extended side effects from algorithms. Some very simple things like collaborative filtering algorithms have had huge negative impacts on bias in various ways. For example, I know from personal experience, and I've talked with some banks about this, usage of collaborative filtering algorithms in fraud detection leads to racial bias. Basically, I'm a white dude, and every now and again I try to buy something from some of my black friends' stores, and I get a fraud detection every time whenever I try to buy something from their store, because according to their algorithm, people like me don't shop at places like that.
Right. How interesting.
But I really want to second, so I believe they mentioned the FDA. The analogy I would use is the USDA, meat inspectors. We don't necessarily need a formal full registry of all algorithms. That the amount of resources it would take to maintain that would be astronomical. However, simply having the possibility of an audit where 10 or 20 top tier programmers are just going to spend a year going over your code base, your data sets, talking with your engineers, and figuring out whether or not you are compliant with the laws with full unfettered access to source code and training data, that simply having the threat of that would be enough to get most companies to be compliant.
Interesting. Thank you.
Can I just comment on that question as well? Because the MHRA and the FDA is an example of a sector that's actually the most far ahead on all of this. They have conformity assessment of medical devices is kind of a done thing. You don't just put it on the market. So and there's different classes of medical devices. There's independent auditors and things like that. But they're starting to get to the point where they don't really know how to actually deal with this problem. They don't have necessarily the AI skills and experience and body of knowledge they can apply to really specific problems. If you're looking at something like readmission predictors in terms of medical conditions and hospital appointments, you need to think about specific types of bias. There's something called readmission bias. You need to think about all of this, and that guidance doesn't all exist in detail yet. But that is a sector, probably the only sector that's leading the way in terms of the real detail and putting that conformity assessment process in place.
So can we have a little bit more of a specific sort of theorize about what an organization that oversaw this sort of thing? I mean, in my little blurb that I put together for this, I mentioned the ICL and Ofcom, or the FDA in the US, and an overseeing body. So how do we visualize such a thing actually working, Ivana?
So if you're an organization, I mean, first of all, is you've got to first of all take ownership of this problem, this issue, and that is really important. When you take ownership of this issue, it means that you bring the right people in the room, and the right people, and bridge the language barrier between sort of coders and lawyers and change management within an organization, and that's not an easy task. And so that is the first step, is just make that decision. And then there are decisions that need to be made. So for example, decision around what fairness means. Fairness doesn't mean the same thing to different people. For example, the idea that people get treated the same regardless, for example, of differences, is not necessarily fairness. Let's say, for example, a bank giving the same loan to people regardless of any other factors. That could mean that you make some people that, for example, traditionally are more likely to lose their income because of sort of inequalities that are entrenched in society. You expose these people to more risks. For example, then their credit the rating becomes even lower. So you're using an idea of a concept of fairness, and you are basically then, with that concept of fairness that you've chosen, you're then entrenching inequality even further. And inequalities fairness means different things to different people. And as I think Adam was kind of hinting, it's a choice, and it's not a neutral choice. I mean, if you want to be fair, you've got to decide, and that's a social political choice, to be fair. If you made this decision that you want to hire 50% women or 50% men, then obviously you've got to make that choice that you want to be, and that means that you override the data as it presents, because because the data themselves will not give you that, because in some areas, you look at engineers or other things. So the reason why I'm saying this is because defining fairness for an organization is really, really important. it means taking ownership. You say, what do I mean as fairness? Do I mean that I simply don't? There's been discussions, especially at the beginning, around we don't use, for example, some kind of data because we want to avoid the discrimination, but the reality is that actually some kind of data, especially data which is around race, that needs to be used to test it. It needs to be used to identify whether an algorithm is biased or not, and that sometimes puts you at odds with some data protection authorities that say, well, actually you cannot use this data, although things are changing. So I mean, before an organization, understanding what they mean by fairness is to me is a crucial thing, and that is part of an organization sort of responsibility. Is something that I feel needs to be made public, communicated, and also an organization needs to be held account for it.
Lovely, Blake.
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in. I actually don't think we need a solid definition of fairness. That's why we have judges. If we simply say it needs to be fair with respect to category, whatever categories we think different applications should be fair with respect to, the oversight body could simply do an audit, prepare a report of what the facts are, what are the behaviors of this algorithm. Then if the oversight body, committee or whatever believes that it's unfair, they could bring formal charges, and then it would be up to a judge or a jury to decide whether or not the behavior of that algorithm is fair. And I think it's important to do it that way, because from experience, writing definitions, if you go that route, it gets slogged down in committee. I don't know how many hundreds of hours we spent arguing over the definition of bias. And the other thing is, once you're getting into these technical definitions, you create loopholes the company can work around. I know for the definition of artificial intelligence, Google's opinion is that the definition of artificial intelligence should either be so narrow that it doesn't apply to any programs in the actual real world, or so broad that it applies to every program ever written.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Interesting point. Adam, I'm gonna come to you on this question that Peter's stuck in the chat, because would like to hear your answer. Do you think CEOs should have to achieve an ethics qualification and not be able to use AI until they have it?
So
I think that's great personally, but I'll let you answer the question.
I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. I think companies should be legally liable for the use of AI. I think it is useful to have a named representative that has that legal accountability, although that has had some effect in GDPR. Ivana probably knows more about that than me. But the critical point, and this is a point we touched on earlier, is this isn't AI companies. This is all companies. If you're using AI, you need to, a lot of the obligations are on you, not the company that built the AI system. ChatGPT, GPT-3, the model, it's like the builders of that cannot anticipate every way that you might put it to use. And if you put it to use in a harmful way, you should be responsible. And a lot of companies don't really think about this. Now, coming to the start of the question, which is, should they have an ethics qualification? I think right now, that's a good idea, but that's only because we don't have the right regulation in place. Ethics and, to a degree, fairness, are quite difficult concepts to put your own risks and the appropriate mitigations from using AI.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. So Paul has put a little comment in here about standardization of AI software development practices, for example. I see you nodding there, Ivana. Do you want to come in on that?
I have mixed views on standards.
Okay.
I think they are the real kingmakers. And I think they will take everybody by surprise, and they will be the real kingmakers across the globe. And that would also be the reflection of massive geopolitical alignment and disalignments that we're seeing around the globe. What I'm saying here is that a lot of how AI systems will be used will be determined by standards which are being produced behind closed doors, where in these committees you see, you can imagine to see huge geopolitical factions and issues arising. and playing their part in there, because obviously that has to do with global trade, and which is the country that is going to impose and to really force on some standards. So to me, they feel they are the real kingmakers here. And I'm glad we got to this point, because I am concerned about the way that these standards have been developed. And I'm concerned that they say that there is going to be involvement of people, but I haven't seen that much so far in this sort of ISO standards and sort of in terms of these. Further to that, the European AI Act, one element which I struggle to understand, they basically say that within 2 years there will be these standards, and they will be the ones that will be need to use in the EU. But the issue is, these standards, where are they? where are they being created? The Senelec is creating them, but where? So there is a little bit of mystery around all of this, which is not good. And that's why I say they're the real kingmakers, because to an extent, there is a lot of giving of power, transferring of power to bodies that are still very much unaccountable, and they don't hold public meetings, and that a lot of people can attend so within this background. So that is a little bit problematic, although they are important and they need to, and they're being developed at the moment. There's just one comment that I wanted to make. Ethics and the law are very different things. And I'm saying this because I heard something about, they're very different things, to an extent. One starts where the other ends, is one informs the other. It's hard but they are different things. And I agree with Blake when he says, you can't leave it to the company. If you leave it to the company, no company will do it, right? And to an extent, Blake, there is also the crux of the problem here is that fairness and efficiency, whether it's the financial efficiency or the company, they are at odds. You cannot say to a bank, you've got to be fair, if that means that you're going to lose money. I mean, you can, but they are going to lose money. So we are in a conundrum here. And the conundrum is that sometimes you may end up in these conflictual situations. So that is why I do take your point, but this is why the values of the company, of the business do become important. Because in the face of potential risk that you have as an organization, you make a choice. So it's both, I feel. In my view, it's both. It's, you need to make companies responsible. And on the other hand, you need to have legislation that enforces all of this. So whether it's audits or whether it's but licensing agency, I would love to see a licensing agency for high risk AI systems. There has to be both, but we need to recognize that sometimes fairness and inefficiency are odds. I mean, one of the key examples of this is if I do adverts and if I want to promote my ad, and I want to say, for example, promote an advert for my client that is a cleaning product. If I want more people to click on it, I would promote it to women, because I know that traditionally women clean the house more than men. But by doing so, I'm not doing anything apart from reinforcing the stereotypes. Yeah. But as a company, I need to make money. So that conundrum is very, very difficult.
I saw you nodding away there, Blake. Yeah,
you bring up a very good point. I think it's a big problem right now that the way these regulations and the penalties for breaking them work is all a financial equation. I mean, there's that quote from Fight Club about whether or not you do a recall on faulty parts. You just put in the numbers, and if paying off the people who die is cheaper than doing the recall, you don't do it. So I think that basic strategy, because it's just a cost of doing business at that point. It's like, how much does it cost to ignore this law? And I guarantee you that is the calculus being done. And for many things, there's simply no penalty other than, say 110% of global profits or whatever, that would be enough to motivate some of these companies to change certain practices. So instead of these massive fines that go into the accounting, why not substitute it with, short-term prison sentences for executives? I think 3 months in prison for a CEO would be much more motivating to a company than a $10 billion fine.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Adam, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to really back Ivana's point about standards being the kingmaker here, but also there being concerns about the ways that some of those standards are being developed. And this is actually how Blake and I know each other, because he was Google's representative at meetings I was chairing on bias standards. I think the UK is actually doing something really amazing in this space. There's something called the AI Standards Hub. And a few weeks ago, we had representatives from different government departments, SMEs, all sorts of people that aren't involved in the standards process come and get involved in really early stage working drafts, which was fantastic. And I think the problem is SMEs and nonprofits don't have time to spend on these kinds of meetings, and the nonprofits that are in these meetings are extremely lightly resourced in this way. So there are big governance questions about the way it's being done, but for reasons I said before, I think it is the right way to regulate technology. But the big risk at the moment is, as Ivana said, will they happen? Because if we get to the end of the transition period on some of the legislation that refers to them and they're not there, the only people that can afford to carry on operating are people with the most expensive lawyers. So that will massively impact SMEs all around Europe and countries that export to Europe.
Thank you, Adam. Now we've got about 5 minutes left. We've had some questions in here that could take another hour, but thank you for the questions. Peter's just said, why not long-term prison sentences, which I'm completely on board with. But let's we'll move on from that. Blake, I just want to address one last thing, which is that the New York Times piece you mentioned yesterday, because actually the other comment Peter's made is Sundar Pichai calling on Europe to come up with an AI Act, not the US, but that's there's something actually in the pipeline here, isn't there?
Yeah, so, well, whether or not it's in the pipeline, there are senators and congresspeople in America calling for AI regulation. And it's people across all political parties are calling for it. It's yet to be seen whether or not the parties can cooperate sufficiently to actually deliver on it. But like, for example, Congressman Ted Lieu had an article in the New York Times yesterday calling for AI, for the creation of exactly the kind of oversight body that we've been talking about. And I know that Republicans, he's a Democrat, Ted Lieu, and I know Republicans have called for similar kinds of things. So this could very well be a bipartisan issue in the United States. Now, why Sundar himself personally is calling out the EU versus the US, I have no idea what kind of reasoning or motivation led to that for that specific person. But we need some kind of, and it just keeps coming back to this, we need some kind of auditing, external independent auditing capacity, or none of the laws that get passed matter. Like without that, nothing else works.
Excellent. Thank you, Blake. We've got a couple of minutes there, folks. I found that really interesting. I'd like to just ask one more thing about this imaginary body that we're talking about here, and that is about its international reach. Just going back to a comment I made earlier, when major parts of the world have such a different sort of approach to even the internet. There was a book recently by Dame Wendy Hall looking at the splitting of the internet into sort of 4 big chunks. You know, the sort of very commercially led US internet, the kind of privacy oriented European internet, the more patrician approach of the Chinese, for example. How can we square that circle when we're talking about something as big as AI? Any thoughts on that with this body that we're discussing? I know that's a pretty big question to answer in 2 minutes, but that's what we've got.
I'll take a crack at it. I don't see it as a problem.
Okay.
I actually see the fact that we have what are essentially international sovereign bodies, companies acting as though they are nation states. That's the problem. Right. So we don't need global megacorps. Break Google into 100 pieces and have a different one for each country and regulate through international trade treaties how these companies can or can't cooperate. Like, that seems the straightforward solution to me.
Thank you, Blake. And any final comments, folks? Ivana, any final comment from yourself?
I think if we want to look at the sort of breaking up, we need to look at what is happening in the cloud, on the cloud side in the cloud industry, right? It's really fascinating. It's really interesting because, you know, the cloud in itself is all about openness and global blah, blah, but then it's used as sovereignty and strategies, so the Europe is going Gaia X, and then Microsoft is going to the cloud. I mean, that is really, to me, that is really emblematic of a new economic model, which is quite problematic for the future, which is the renter economic model. But maybe, Brian, we could have a webinar on that.
Sounds like you ought to, yeah.
Yes, that is a really fascinating topic, and so that is one. But I don't have the same approach that you have, Blake. I fear, to an extent, this concept around sort of sovereignty, and I fear it in the sense that I understand that, take, for example, a country like India, right? India's got 700 million smartphone users, and correctly so. They say, well, why should we have our data being grabbed by a multinational company that is Silicon Valley based and take all our data to train their algorithm, as in a similar fashion that, for example, China is doing in Africa, right? So that is an issue around the democratic governance around data, and there's a topic in itself. But I am a little bit fearful about the fragmentation that we're seeing. And I am a little bit fearful of, for example, all this issue around the data localization and all these issues that we're seeing around sort of the cross-border transfers of data, because I do feel that they're a little bit of a smokescreen. And I would, to an extent, I would sort of like politics to take precedence to all this. But as it happens with data, with big corporations, especially the politics of data, they somehow take they come first. They show you the sort of much bigger a much bigger picture, and so that's why they need to be looked at details. So I'm a bit concerned about the fragmentation that we're seeing at the moment.
Oh, thanks, Ivana. So, Adam, perhaps we could have a last comment from you. Perhaps with your BCS hat on, if that's all right.
Well, with my BCS hat on, I'd say one huge gap we've got is the capability and competency of regulators to actually enforce things. And one of the things BCS is involved in is developing professional standards for people that work with AI. And I think that's one really important step that we need to get through before we can really have an effective regulatory regime.
Thank you, Adam. Can I thank everyone so much? I'm aware that we've had a few questions that we haven't answered. If you have any burning issues you'd like to bring up, please email the editorial address at BCS, which is editor@bcs.org, and we'll perhaps farm that out and see what we can do with other questions. But what I'd like to do now is say thanks so much to Blake. Really enjoyed your presentation and your comments. Thanks to Ivana. Thanks to Adam. It's been really interesting. I think we might have to have a few more of these. It was really good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, it was fun.